all the action in Washington right now, and we just had some breaking news on the show, Donald Trump's also facing another impeachment-related problem in New York, where federal prosecutors were back in court today, arguing with one of the indicted associates of Rudy Giuliani, who was trying to claim he's not a flight risk. A judge decided to keep him on house arrest. This is the case in the famously independent Southern District of New York that convicted Trump's other lawyer, Michael Cohen, and is also investigating Giuliani, who is now reportedly in advanced discussions to hire a veteran of that office as his defense attorney. And that's not the only legal headache for Giuliani that could also echo in Trump's Washington, because in a very different suit, Giuliani's private communications on Ukraine are about to be released. A judge ordering the Trump State Department to basically unveil Rudy's text messages and emails to a watchdog group. No one else knows exactly what that will reveal, but it could add to other leads we're seeing like this one. The Daily Beast reporting that Giuliani's politicking in Ukraine extended to meeting with the Ukraine president's rival and discussing military aid, which is, of course, an issue at the center of the plot that's brought Trump so close to impeachment. So is Giuliani in real new trouble? Is he putting his most famous client in extra danger right now? Back with Daily Beast reporter Erin Banco, who broke this story on Giuliani meeting with Ukraine's prime minister, as well as a friend of the beat and former federal prosecutor John Flannery, who we should mention as we turn to this story, once worked as a prosecutor with Rudy Giuliani. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
What is the significance of the revelations in your story?
So basically what my colleague and Sam Stein and I found out is that Rudy Giuliani met with Yulia Tymoshenko back December 5th, 2018. Now, the timing of that meeting is pretty significant. We know that Mr. Giuliani has said publicly that his quote-unquote political interest in Ukraine started somewhere around November 2018. We know he held business contracts in the country before that. But again, remember, this is right around the time when Giuliani is starting to dig up dirt and find information about the origins of the FBI investigation into the 2016 election, and is starting to ask political questions with people like Tymoshenko. So obviously this raised questions for us about what exactly was discussed. And we do know that the two discussed things like military aid, future U.S.-Ukraine relations. And we've been told that Mr. Giuliani approached Tymoshenko about the meeting.
Yeah, and you say he approached her, and you'd show how far back this goes. And that would seem to at least contradict some of the way or the suggestions that Rudy has made about what he's doing and why he's doing it. Take a look.
I never talked to a Ukrainian official until the State Department called me and asked me to do it. And then I reported every conversation back to them. And Laura, I'm a pretty good lawyer, just a country lawyer, but it's all here, right here. The first call from the State Department. The debriefing of the State Department.
Why are
Does your reporting and timeline suggest that that wasn't the whole truth?
Exactly. It definitely raises additional questions about exactly what Mr. Giuliani was up to at the time. We did talk to one source very familiar with the conversation between Giuliani and Tymoshenko, who said that Giuliani was quote unquote trolling for business, but also, had an interest in talking politics with Tymoshenko. And at this time, you have to remember that Tymoshenko was up in the polls. Everyone thought she would win the presidential election. Now, she's in the U.S. during this time period, and she's meeting with a lot of different people, including sort of lower level officials like Kurt Volker, who we know about, State Department official George Kent, and then thrown in the mix is Rudy Giuliani. And so this definitely raises additional questions and sort of points to the fact that Giuliani has perhaps talked about politics with Ukrainian officials, things like aid, which we, of course, know is central to the impeachment probe, far earlier than he mentioned previously.
John, what do you see as important here?
Well, it's a powerful story with dramatic disclosures. And what I see is they're covering their bases, who may become the leader of Ukraine. They want to put them in this position, this squeeze play that ultimately requires a call from no less than Trump himself, set up by his mouthpiece, Rudy Giuliani. And it'll be interesting to see when the State Department material is released, how far back is their date. And what we may find is we may find that Pompeo, who appears to have been very comfortable with the request that Ivanovich, the ambassador to Ukraine, be removed at the request of Rudy and Livingston, and there was another one from Texas, another member of Congress who's involved in the frickin' frack conspiracy. all of these people come together.
You could lose track of them at a certain point, right?
You could lose, yeah,
All the
and I have a little bit.
conspiracies.
But the significant juncture is where is Pompeo in this formula of early goings on? And it looks like it would be a directive from Trump to do this, but we don't have that answer yet.
If I'm understanding you right, John, you're saying that, one theory of the case would be Rudy basically lied about who was running this and how far back it went. That he's holding up his phone and claiming, I was doing it all at the behest of the State Department, when in fact, other officials have said, no, you came in and tried to hijack this. The other possibility is that those officials who felt hijacked, who were, mid to senior, didn't know. You're saying a second theory of the case would be that maybe really at a higher level, Trump and whatnot, there was an agreement very early on to have him do some of this stuff, earlier than we've known.
Well, we know Pompeo is involved by May of 2019 because that's when he receives the material on his desk and he receives phone calls about Ivanovich to get rid of her because she's considered an obstruction to this rogue plan that Rudy Giuliani and others had.
Erin, what are the final questions you have unanswered here?
So I think what's also really interesting about this story is that we know a former congressman from Ohio, Bob McEwen, set up this meeting between Tymoshenko and Rudy Giuliani. And I think that's pretty important. Here's why. We know that Bob McEwen is actually relatively close with Vice President Mike Pence, has been pictured alongside President Trump and at several events at the White House. He's also close with Robert Livingston, who was mentioned in a story, I believe, by the New York Times the other day, who was sort of central and integral to the ousting of Yovanovitch. So I think this sort of raises some questions about how involved some of these other characters were in Giuliani's efforts to make connections with Ukrainian officials, including Ms. Tymoshenko.
It's really fascinating, especially given that we're talking about who are the people that are supposed to be in charge and actually in charge of U.S. foreign policy, of military money, of the power that the Congress has lately said may have been abused by the president. Erin Banco with the reporting, John Flannery, as always, with the law. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.